This video is sponsored by Zombie Lips. Do you want to be like those creatures digging themselves up from the graveyard? Those flesh-eating zombies? Well, no worries, because the cure is here. Zombielips.squarespace.com has care packages ready to cure your dry zombie lips and cracked skin with post-apocalyptic themed lip balms and lotions. I tried it myself, and the lip balm was minty, soothing goodness that kept me from eating the brains I once craved. So check out zombielips.squarespace.com to get your cure today. Thanks, Zombie Lips. We gather our dead just below the surface, but they will rise in more ways than one. This world is a strange one. Have you ever just stepped back and looked at the practice of burials? We take plots of land to bury the dressed-up corpses of our loved ones, after we put makeup on them, of course. It's a way to honor their memories, to give us a location to visit them. But where the dead gather, things can get a little creepy. Graveyards are infamous for being spooky, often haunted places, so let's visit the local cemetery and see what scary stories we can dig up. But first, be sure to visit deathbyfear.com to submit your stories today. I just can't get enough of your scary stories. Number 1. Don't Move. Submitted by Emma D. I'm 13 years old and I live in Austin, Texas. The neighborhood I live in is a safe environment, or so I thought. This happened over spring break, and I'll never forget it. I was staying with my best friend for the week, seeing as her parents were out of town. She didn't really want to be alone at the time. Let's call her Zoe. The first night was a normal night, although we didn't like what happened the next night. Because we were sitting in her room that night just starving to death, we decided to look for food in the house, but we couldn't find anything. So we decided to go out and get some food for ourselves. I grabbed my money and she grabbed hers. We opened the creaky door and walked out. As we got onto the sidewalk onto the main road, I had this uneasy feeling in my stomach. It was like someone was watching us from afar. I told her we should walk a little faster. She must have felt the same way, because she agreed without a word. So we sped up and finally reached the store. Being a couple of teenagers, we bought the most delicious junk food we could find, and then we left. Zoe was so hungry that she wanted to eat something on the way back, so she was digging around in the plastic bag, and I think we all know how noisy those things can be. But that's when I suddenly heard the sound of a branch snapping, and then subsequently it fell. I was surprised, and I turned to where the noise was. Now on this road back to her house, there was a graveyard there just across the way. It was creepy to behold, and just at the edge of the fence that surrounded it stood a tall, dead tree. The same kind of snap came again, and as I was looking in that direction, I saw a small twig fall from one of the branches. So of course I looked up, expecting to see a bird or possum, some sort of creature of the night, but I was staring straight at what looked like an older woman, a woman in a tree. Her hair was matted and crusty, and her eyes were black. It took me a moment to realize I was looking at empty sockets, not eyes. Her body appeared to be covered in third-degree burns. The lady had this wide grin, and she was deathly still. I honestly thought it was some sort of Halloween decoration, long forgotten in the tree just behind the graveyard fence. But then she, or it, began to move, and then it let out this horrific, inhuman scream. I stared in horror, and I had no idea that we were screaming too, until this creature's scream finally quieted down. I grabbed Zoe's hand and I ran, but I could hear the pitter-patter of the woman's footsteps following us. The steps sounded light, but they had this telltale tapping that must have been her nails clattering on the road. It sent chills down my spine. Luckily, I don't live far from Zoe, and my house was just around the corner. My parents always left a hidden key just outside, I snatched it up and opened the door, slamming it shut after Zoe ran in. Only a few seconds later, we heard clawing at the door. I made a split-second decision, fearing for our lives. I ran upstairs to get the extra handgun my mom had. She would kill me if she knew that I handled it. She always taught me to stay away from guns, to think that any and every gun is loaded, even if it's not. But that night, I thought it was either us or this thing. Frantically, I tried to find bullets to it, which were hidden away in a separate cabinet. I heard Zoe scream from downstairs, and I panicked even more. I managed to load a few rounds into it, and I stumbled back downstairs. Zoe was crying, and I don't blame her, because I was out of breath and crying as well. I looked through the peephole, and the lady was sitting on the porch, sitting like some dog. I then yelled at her, telling her that I had a gun, that if she didn't leave, I would use it. She got up on her tiptoes and put her face right into the peephole on the other side. She then gave another terrifying grin. Her teeth were rotted. Honestly, this woman, she looked like she should be dead. I turned to Zoe, asking her to call 911, only taking my eyes from the peephole for a split second, and when I looked back, she was gone. My hands were trembling while I held the gun. It took me a few minutes just standing there at the door to calm down, before the thought of holding a loaded weapon that I did not know how to use properly forced me to unload it and put it away exactly as I had found it. It was over, or at least I hoped it was. Nothing happened for the rest of that night. In the early morning, we walked in silence together back to Zoe's house. The next night, I was about to take a shower, but of course I was paranoid and creeped out at this point, and they had a window upstairs in the bathroom, one that happened to overlook that same road, and I could very plainly see the cemetery in the distance. It scared me so much to see it that I had to ask Zoe to sit on the toilet lid while I showered. I could really use the company. After what happened, she didn't want to be alone either, not even for a second, so she didn't have any problem accompanying me. I peered out of the curtain before stepping into the shower, making sure no one or nothing was outside, and that the curtains were in a way that nothing could be peering in. But as I pulled the curtains open to check, I had to bite my lip not to scream. It was the same woman. I couldn't believe it, but before I could scream, Zoe screamed behind me. Apparently she was seeing what I was. The decaying woman smiled again, before dipping her head below the window and just completely disappearing. We didn't even try to check if she was still out there. We backed away from the window, locked the bathroom door, and just held each other as we trembled for the next couple of hours. Once we gathered our courage, we exited the bathroom and locked both doors, checking the whole house for any signs of intruders. We seemed to be alone. We finished that night by curling up on the couch together, silently, watching TV that we weren't even paying attention to. But something did come up. It was a 9 o'clock news report, a report about a grave robbery. The body of a woman had been dug up and ransacked. They even showed pictures of what the woman looked like when she was alive, and the moment I recognized that face and smile, I could barely breathe. It was the same woman, the same creature that had been tormenting us these past couple of nights. I decided to Google her name on my cell phone, and come to find out she had died a few years back in a fire. This explained everything. This wasn't some menacing psycho of a homeless person, or someone in costume trying to prank us or scare us. This was the angry, tormented spirit of a woman who died young, a painful, painful death, only to have someone disturb her grave a few years later. Number 2. Rhode Island Vampire. Submitted by KELSEY R. My story begins in October of 2016. My ex-boyfriend Ricky wanted to go to Mercy L. Brown's grave in Exeter, Rhode Island. You may be wondering why. Well, let me give you the old legend. There was this scary disease killing people, a disease that no one understood at the time. It began affecting Mercy's family right after she died. Her family began to strangely fall ill and perish. Now they blamed her for the phenomenon. They dug up her corpse and discovered that her body still had blood flowing through it and that she hadn't begun to decay yet over the course of time which she had been deceased. Of course, they were terrified at this fact, so they assumed that Mercy had been coming up from her grave. They removed her heart and burned it on the stone near her grave. Ever since then, it's rumored to be haunted and a hotspot for sightings of Mercy herself. They say that Mercy is out to get revenge on those who decided to disrespect her grave. I've always been fascinated by the paranormal and history since I was 9, and when they collided together, it made for some curious things. At the time I was finally 18 and I had a new license, I wanted to get up and go out. Apparently Ricky had been there quite a few times and knew exactly where to go. Mind you, I was kind of a scaredy cat when it came to things like this. Heck, I was even used to sleeping with the light on still. I often couldn't sleep unless there was some kind of background noise to keep me company, with my door shut and locked. I've been this way since I was a child. Well, we drove into the cemetery around 2 in the morning, and I shut off my headlights and drove in further. Suddenly Ricky says, "Stop right here. Come on, get out with me." I tell him I didn't agree to get out, I only wanted to come along. We bickered for a moment about going out. I was scared of actually visiting her grave. After a few minutes of going back and forth, I finally agreed to get out, to gather my courage. I grabbed a flashlight and turned it on, and I walked hesitantly out onto the graves. We were only a few yards from hers, and when I saw it, it looked exactly like what I had seen when I was a child. I'd seen photos of this grave before, but all the pictures I had seen would show 19 pennies on her grave, a sort of offering of respect. So when I saw that the pennies weren't there that night, I decided to go back in my car and grab 19 of my own, placing them on her grave the same way I remembered in those pictures. I turned around to see Ricky smoking and leaning against the car. I was honestly a bit disgusted and disappointed. Not at the smoking exactly, but the fact that he was doing it out on someone's grave. This was a place of mourning and memory, but as I looked at Ricky, I saw a silhouette pass behind him. There were no flashlights, but I was certain that someone was out there with us. Ricky must have seen my eyes widened, and he looked behind himself. "What are you looking at?" he asked. I thought I saw someone behind you," I said. Now, this was also happening around the time that all those clowns were being sighted, and I was sure that we were going to be that typical horror movie couple that got killed first. But I had no intentions of joining those in the cemetery that night, so we got back into the car and decided to drive out of there. The whole time, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had goose flesh on my skin. But the further we got away from the cemetery, the better I felt. Ricky played some music on the radio, and it put my mind at ease. By the time I dropped him off at his house, it was 3:30 in the morning. I was on my way home alone in my car, trying to ignore the fact that it was the witching hour. Besides, it was only a 5 to 10 minute ride to my place. This is when things get really scary. At one point, I decided to look in my mirror, checking for other people on the road. But at this time of night, I was completely alone on the roads. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw a girl sitting in my back seat. One that didn't look happy. One that didn't look alive. I instantly panicked, losing control of my car for a moment. I stared ahead on the road, trying to regain control. And when I did and looked back in the mirror, the girl was gone. I couldn't stop looking back there. I glanced every second, trying to make sure that I wasn't just hallucinating. I'd never been more scared in my life. The moment I got home, I parked my car and left everything in it. I didn't bother bringing in my stuff. I just took my keys, locked it, and got inside the house. The next day, I went out to my car to check for any signs of the little girl, and I found tears in the cloth of my back seat. Tears I would have noticed if they were there. I love my car, and I try to take care of it. I definitely would have known if someone tore up my back seat. Since that day, I've only been back to the graveyard 3 times, and I've only been back to leave more peace offerings to pay my respects. I try to give her a few words of kindness, and if I bring a friend, I make sure they do the same. Ricky and I broke up after that, but we're still good friends. Yet, we never suggest going back there for any more adventure. Number 3. Something tried to possess my mother. Submitted by Match M. The Wisconsin autumn day was coming to a close. The sun was beginning to set as Grandma Steele drove my mom, Aunt Katie, and myself home after a day at my Uncle Roy's in Choteau. This had been one of the more peaceful moments with my family. In fact, I remember laughing as my mom and Grandma Steele told stories from when they were young. The story topic had eventually turned to the paranormal, from the tale of the ghost hitchhiker to the ghostly bride that I had encountered myself a couple of years prior. Everything was fine until after we passed this old cemetery. That's when something happened, something that scares me to this day. My mom looked out the window at the passing trees for a bit, then turned to us and said, "Man, that sun is bright." She turned to look toward the trees in the graveyard again, and then she suddenly went limp. In a panic, my grandma pulled over the car. She turned on the emergency lights and unbuckled her seatbelt. At first, she and my aunt thought it was something with my mom's blood sugar. Maybe it had tanked or something like that. She was struggling with diabetes at the time. I wish that had been the case. I really do, since that could have been dealt with. Grandma Steele, having medical experience from her years as a nurse, unbuckled my mom carefully to try to prevent injury to her neck. Her head was slumped over. My aunt was trying to get mom to speak to us, but the reaction she got instead is what scared us all as we knelt there with my mother in a panic, only a few yards away from this creepy cemetery. My mom's head suddenly turned and sort of flopped as she looked at my aunt. A look of terror formed on Aunt Katie's face as she looked at my grandma and myself. Only when someone would speak to her, she would respond this way. She had such a blank look in her green eyes as her mouth was agape. She looked to be screaming, but with no noise coming out. At this point, I had dialed 911 on my cell phone, ready to push it if we couldn't get my mom out of whatever this was. Grandma Steele looked to the sky and exclaimed, "Ross, this would be a good time to help." Ross was a member of the family that had passed. All the while, my aunt was telling whatever it was she thought had gotten into my mom to get out and leave. At this point, I was panicking, crying and blurting out, "Please help my mom." Shortly after all of this, my mom came to, so to speak. Whatever had happened or whatever was there was gone, and mom didn't know what had happened at all. She simply went back to consciousness and hugged the three of us. She was confused and obviously as scared as we were. As my grandmother cried as she hugged her daughter, I could hear her whispering thanks to the family members who had passed away. The moment we could, we got my mom to a doctor. We wanted to know the medical cause of what this was, something explainable by science. Yet all the tests came up with nothing. It baffled neurologists, and nobody could come up with what could have caused this sudden seizure-like phenomenon. They said save for the diabetes, my mother was healthy, her blood sugar was fine, and there was no reason she should have seized up like that. And let me tell you, we got several second opinions, and they all said and concluded the same thing. There was nothing that could have caused that. To this day, my family avoids that cemetery, and my grandma has confessed to having feelings of fear and dread when we passed it before. My mom doesn't remember a thing, and only knows what we know based on us being witnesses. We don't talk much about that event anymore, but what I can't get out of my head was that silent scream that my mother had. The way her mouth was opened in a wail. I'd never seen such a look of pain on anyone's face before. Number 4. Black-Eyed Creature. Submitted by MADNAT. This happened when I was 17. I was living with my parents in Canada. I had just came out of a 2-year relationship with my very abusive ex-boyfriend that had been living with us. It had been about 2 months since I told him we were through, but he was insistent, trying to get me to come back to him by being really sweet. acting like he had changed back to how he was when we first started dating. He would text me sweet things and then tell me that I was nothing without him and that I was making a big mistake by letting him go. He had this back and forth good guy, bad guy routine, and I was just getting tired of it. I was beginning to feel emotionally numb. I began to feel little towards anyone at all, and I went into a bit of a depression. I just felt like a ghost of myself, just floating through life, not doing or achieving anything, which didn't help the fact that I had dropped out of college shortly before the breakup. It was very hard for me to say I love you to my parents, because honestly I didn't feel it. I didn't feel anything. We had 2 cats and 3 dogs at the time. My room was at the far end of the house, beside the main bathroom and the spare bedroom, which used to be mine before my sister moved out. I had moved into her room because it was larger. My parents' room was at the other end of the house, just past the kitchen, with the living room between my room and the kitchen itself. We built an addition onto the house with my dad's office and a den that is directly across from the spare room and living room. There is a wall separating the living room and den with a large opening near the kitchen. I hope that gives you a decent idea of the layout of the house. It is a bit important. I also need to mention that across from our house is a cemetery. It has always scared me. I never liked being so close to a graveyard, but I grew up with it, even if it was home to many ghost sightings that I've heard around the years. Anyway, one day I was playing games on my computer, trying to distract myself while my parents were both at work. Suddenly, this feeling of being watched came over me. I had my door open and my computer was set up right beside my door, so all I had to do was lean a bit to see down the hall and into the den. I looked out there. I didn't see any of the pets and there was no one there, so I just shrugged and went back to playing on my games. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something with black eyes and a white head. But when I leaned and looked again, the thing would dart behind the wall or doorway. I was extremely paranoid at this point. I didn't think I was alone in the house any longer. I thought I was just getting tired or stressed. My mind was racing even while I was playing those games, so I decided to get up and grab something to drink from the kitchen. As I walked down the hallway, I swear I saw this thing darting from one spot to another to watch me as I went. I was almost certain that I wasn't just seeing things at this point. Whatever it was, something had gotten into our house. I grabbed my drink and headed back to my room, still emotionally numb, just trying to ignore whatever this was. At this point, I had only seen glances and blurs. I figured if it was anything, it was probably a possum or raccoon that got inside the house. After an hour or so more of playing games on the computer, I needed to use the bathroom, and I had almost completely forgotten about the thing I'd been seeing. Again, I wasn't emotionally stable at the time. The moment I got done using the bathroom and I opened the bathroom door, I'll never forget what I saw standing there. Whatever had been watching me from around those corners, it was now standing right in front of me. It was about an inch taller than I am, which would make it about 5'8". It had short, white hair with a black nose, not unlike a cat's nose, and it had massive black eyes. Its ears were small divots in the sides of its head, and it had 2 large claws for hands, but its back legs were those of a goat. They bent the same way and had black cloven hooves. I was gasping for air, and the moment I blinked, the creature was gone. I stumbled backward after that, landing square on the toilet seat. I was dumbfounded and terrified. I decided to exit the house and just wait on the porch for my parents to get home. It took me a very long time to actually explain what I saw to someone else, and when I did, I discovered a chilling truth. My father explained to me that our house once sat on a graveyard. It had been relocated to another area of the graveyard across our home, but it had definitely been there. Remembering this now sends chills down my whole body and makes my heart pound. I can only guess as to what I saw that day. I think we lived on haunted grounds where spirits of any kind wandered. I think something tried to take advantage of my emotional state, of my weakness. I'm just lucky that whatever that was, that demonic entity, I've never seen it since. and I never want to again. And number 5, A Date to Die For. Submitted by Grace A. My boyfriend, as much as I love him, can be a little odd at times. The following is what happened when I made the mistake of letting him plan one of our date nights. Let me say off the bat, I've changed his name for the story, so let's call him James. James came to my house one night to pick me up around 7. We went to my favorite restaurant. We were at the next town over. The dinner was nice, and a little over an hour later, I thought we were headed back to my house. Oddly, it was quite early to be going home. It wasn't a weeknight. My curfew wasn't until midnight. My mother had a lot of trust in me, so she didn't mind me staying out too late. It was something I'm not sure she'd still have if she knew what happened that night. As soon as we passed my road, I looked over to James to ask where we were going. Then we pulled down Sherwood Avenue. Now I knew. See, in our small town, there's very little to do. One thing is a small movie theater. Now I'll be frank, the place was horrible at the time. Most people from our town probably won't even call it a theater. After all, it was in the basement of the town's largest church. The setup was just a bunch of beanbags and chairs. And when it wasn't a theater, sometimes the kids would have Sunday school down there. Today was special for this little place, however. It was Friday the 13th after all. So they were planning on playing a horror movie, which is something I've never seen them do, considering it is a church. Even still, the movie was horrible. The only thing putting it under the horror genre was jump scares. We headed upstairs talking about how dumb it was. When we made our way through the door, I headed for the exit, but James suddenly grabbed my hand. "Hey, I have an idea." I raised an eyebrow. He pulled at my hand. "Come on, I'll show you." We walked into the altar room and to a door on the side. He opened the door, and I saw the graveyard that sat at the back of the church. He said, if a movie couldn't scare us, we'll have to scare ourselves. I paused. He waited by the door, eventually saying, "Are you coming, or are you too scared?" Like an idiot, I let my pride get the better of me. I stepped past him into the outskirts of the graveyard. Nothing too bad so far, just the normal feeling you get when you're worried. You know, the twisted stomach, the hair standing on end. And I thought I felt someone breathing on my neck. I turned around figuring it was James trying to be creepy. But when I did, I saw that he wasn't at the door or behind me. He was to my left. I was instantly weirded out. He pulled me along, walking beside me and holding my hand. I listened though, focusing on everything around me. I was just creeped out. James stopped and looked around. Then without warning, he sat down and pulled me down with him. He laughed as I rolled his eyes. "So you just want to sit in a graveyard?" He nodded his head. "And try to get scared," he said. "How do you figure we do that?" "I don't know," he said. "I don't think there's anything out here with the guts to scare us." Oh great, I thought. He was now taunting the dead. He kept messing around like that for a few minutes, before I threw my hand over his mouth. I was starting to get annoyed or angry. I told him maybe we should go, but of course he wanted to stay and scare me. So he stood up, and he began to walk off into the cemetery. I should have turned the other way, I should have left, but like a love-struck puppy, I followed after him. He was walking faster than I thought he was, and it was too dark to see very far in front of me. I walked alone for a few minutes. At this point, I just wanted to find my way back to the car. I saw James standing with his back turned towards me, so I walked over to him, angry, and I grabbed his arm, telling him it was time to leave. Only when I reached out and tried to grab him, my hand went right through him. As it did, my hand felt freezing cold. He turned around slowly. When I saw his face, he looked almost normal, but he was pale and his skin was gray, and his eyes looked blank and hollow. That's when I fell backwards, holding my chest and landing on the wet grass. I could hear something running towards me. I crawled backwards on the ground until my back hit something behind me. It was someone's grave, but I could hear whatever this thing was getting closer and closer, louder, and it was coming right towards me. I then closed my eyes, screaming at whatever it was to let me go. Something grabbed my wrist, and then I heard, "Grace, stop, it's me." It was James. I opened my eyes to see his blurry outline through my distorting tears. His face looked normal now. He wasn't pale or gray, and his eyes were full of life and a bit worried. He said when he saw I wasn't there behind him, he thought I went back to the car. He said he was halfway back when he heard me scream. I didn't remember screaming, to be honest. He pulled me up to my feet, and I told him I wanted to leave. Now, this happened in May, and it definitely shouldn't have been that cold out there. When we got back to the truck, he turned the heat on. I could feel the heat, but still shook. At this point, I wasn't sure it was due to the cold. This was the most terrifying and unexplainable encounter I've ever had. The feeling I had when my hand passed through that thing, it was the most hateful, painful thing I've ever felt. It is such a traumatic event to lose a loved one. It's something that we all must go through someday. Something we all like to ignore until it actually happens. But sometimes life doesn't seem to stop after death. Sometimes the dead contact us in some way. But the thing is, it's not always a pleasant thing, because many people just aren't happy when they pass on into the afterlife, and they love to let the living know about it. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And don't forget to send us your true scary stories today at deathbyfear.com. Thanks.